You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 17th of July, 2024 on Monocle Radio.
The Republican National Convention gets weirder and weirder. Syria votes for all the difference it is likely to make. And is the open all hours ethic overrated? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Sean Ryan and Kate Clark will discuss the day's big stories, and we will visit the new exhibition making the case for Barbie as a cultural catalyst. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Kate Clark, former BBC correspondent and currently co-director of the Afghanistan Analysts Network, and by Sean Ryan, director of media at Save the Children. Hello to you both.
Hello.
First of all, I discovered from speaking to you both earlier that while some of us were just sitting here in the studio making fun of the recent general election in the UK, you were both out participating in it. You were knocking on doors, attempting to win hearts and minds. Kate, how was that for you?
Well, I had two friends running, both for the Labour Party, and both succeeded in turning over Tory majorities, one in Kent and one in Lincoln. And it was great. I was really just impressed by, the amount of energy amongst local activists. People actually really, I didn't do that much because Rishi Sunak managed to call the elections when I was away a lot. But there were a lot of people just grafting day in, day out, unpaid, for the love of it. And people are interesting once you start talking to them. As
Really?
we know, journalists.
Are they, though?
Know that, yes. People don't fall into boxes. So we'd have people in Kent who were Remainers in terms of the EU. Worried about house building and immigration. Things that I think as if you're a political journalist you wouldn't expect. I don't know. I really, really enjoyed it. I felt quite boosted by the whole experience.
Sean, what about you? How was your sort of earful of the Vox Populi?
Well, I'm recovering from two elections. The first was the adult general election, where I was campaigning in Edinburgh for a friend, also from Labour, and also victorious in the end. But she taught me...
We've really unveiled the institutional political biases of this programme, haven't we?
She taught me that if somebody unfriendly came to the door with their dog, all you had to do was point to the dog and say, "Who's this?" And they would tell you the name of their dog, they would tell you all about their dog, and then they would promise you their vote. The first unfriendly person who came to the door for me, I said, "Who's this?" to the really unfriendly-looking dog. And he just said, "It's my dog," and then proceeded to say that the last person he would vote for was my friend, and slammed the door in my face. So that didn't really work. And then I switched my attention to the children's general election, which Save the Children helped to organise in 500 schools and youth clubs around the place. And children are so much nicer than adults. And they say very profound things like adults vote according to what's happening now. But when children vote, they're thinking about the future.
Well, elections are going to be, happily, something of a recurring theme of tonight's episode, and we will start, if more out of duty than enthusiasm, with the ongoing coronation of Donald Trump at the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee. Recent treats at this event have included abject demonstrations of obeisance from those who dared challenge him for the nomination, including former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley, current Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, and annoying weirdo Vivek Ramaswamy. Other speakers warned darkly of the gloom and chaos which will envelop America should voters fail to re-elect a convicted criminal and court-declared sex offender. Here is Jim Justice, governor of West Virginia, who appeared on stage with his dog, which may have eaten his speech or written it.
The bottom line to every single thing that's going on in this great country today is one thing. We become totally unhinged if Donald Trump is not elected in November.
Become totally unhinged. I do try to be a credit where due guy Kate, as regular listeners will be aware. Jim Justice, I will say, has a fabulous name and a fantastic accent. I mean, that's absolutely glorious. You could listen to it all day, whatever gibberish it is spouting. But what have you made of the general tone of the convention so far?
Well, I don't know. It's just so different from British politics. I mean, really. And most other places.
There's fewer balloons in British politics.
The hero worshipping. And actually, even for Biden, I don't know if you saw the recent, he did an appearance, and there was the crowds chanting and whooping, and I find it a bit pathetic. And particularly with the Republicans, all this stuff about God and the most ungodly man
I know.
to rule their country. It's a cognitive dissonance that I find really difficult.
It is extraordinary. Sean, a simple but I believe effective electoral reform I would impose is that anybody who has ever in any circumstances chanted the name of a politician at a rally should be deprived of the vote. But going back to the Republican convention, is it weird to see all these people who did try to challenge Trump falling in behind him? I mean, is there really none in America? Well, no, I think was the phrase I was looking for. No, in America, remaining non-Trump conservative base.
I think Trump has really extended his hold over the party, and the assassination attempt did him no harm as far as that was concerned. So he's gone from being this really polarising influence to talking about national unity, and from being very arrogant on the stage to this sort of I'm lucky to be alive humility that we've seen in his appearances so far. And I think he's really hoping that not only can he win this time, but he can also establish a legacy for the future, because he's appointed in J.D. Vance, somebody half his age, who can expect to go on and be a presidential nominee in 4 years' time. It happens to be
there's a presidential election in 4 years' time.
That's quite a big if. And is also the best friend forever of Donald Trump Jr. So that Trump influence you could see lasting not just for 4 years, but for really quite a long time.
And not much personal experience, so doesn't really carry his own political capital. I mean, he's in the pocket of Donald Trump, I'd have thought.
Yes, he's. I think the experience that he brings, which Trump regards as valuable, is white working class upbringing, son of a heroin addict, grew up in Rust Belt, Ohio, and can rally the white working class behind the Republicans in a way that some of the other people who are named in speculation about who would be the vice presidential nominee would not have been able to do.
There is some suggestion, Kate, and we will be hearing from J.D. Vance later, and if people can't wait that long, I can reveal the Foreign Desk Explainer this week, which should be going live now or nowabouts, is very much concerned with J.D. Vance. But there is some suggestion, Kate, that the reason he has been selected, or a reason he has been selected, is that while Trump pivots to sort of grandfather of the nation, national unifier, etc., J.D. Vance will be sent out to do the culture war attack dog stuff.
Yes, yeah, and he's really slick. I mean, he's forgetting about his politics, which listeners may like or not like. He's a good talker, and I wonder what the Democrats are going to be feeling as well about this youthful person on the podium.
Yeah, I think there's a fairly obvious rebuke to the Democrat ticket there as well. On which subject, Sean? Do you get the sense... I mean, it is very weird watching how the news cycle has done a 180-degree screech away from the Democrats' travails. I mean, not ununderstandably, an assassination attempt of a presidential candidate is a big whoop, whichever way you slice it. But there is much less now overt speculation about whether or not the Democrats should dump Biden. Do you think the moment for that may have passed? Is it going to be Biden versus Trump?
I think the moment for that has passed. I think the Democrats would look very self-indulgent if they were arguing among themselves just after an attempted assassination. And I think all the focus is on Trump now. And the Democrats are using that to bring forward some of the voting in their own convention, which is now going to start on August the 1st, this voting. And it means that by the time the convention starts, Biden may be secure as the nominee.
One cute manoeuvre we have seen from President Biden in the last 24 hours, Kate, is he has called for a ban on the AR-15 and other such assault weapons like the one that very nearly killed Donald Trump on Saturday. It is noticeable that the gun lobby have been on the the taciturn side, I think it's fair to say, since Saturday. But even as I ask this question, I realise I'm already answering it. Is there any chance at all that the very near assassination of the figurehead of American conservatism will prompt any American conservatives to rethink the Second Amendment?
I doubt it. I haven't heard anything about that. I mean, most Americans want gun control. It's a majority, but they're not. They don't have the power to enact their wishes. But we're talking 43,000 people killed last year by guns. 600 mass shootings. That's an average of 2 a day. That's mass shootings. I did think, actually, when I heard the news after my "oh my goodness, what's happened" moment was, well, if not, school children, why not an ageing presidential contender? I mean, fair's fair.
And just finally on the Republican National Convention, Sean, this is by far not the biggest issue that will be addressed, but would you like to take a punt on whether or not Melania is going to grace it with her presence at any point?
It would be astonishing if she didn't. So although she's not expected to speak, I think she is expected to turn up. She did release, or a statement was released in her name, shall we say, calling for national unity after the attack on her husband. But it's really the other members of the family where there's a lot of interest in. Ivanka, who was such an influence before, is out. Supposedly spending more time with her family, as she said, and in has come Lara Trump, daughter-in-law of Donald Trump and co-chair of the Republican National Committee, as a new star of the Trump family, alongside Donald, who, as the friend of Vance, is thought to be about to wield a lot of power if Trump returns to the White House.
Well, that is something to look forward to, but we will now move on, and as regular listeners, like we have any other kind and so forth, will be aware, 2024 is a chorus of the Vox Populi unprecedented in the history of democracy, with more than half the world's population invited to cast a ballot in some or other election. One of the very least interesting of these is the parliamentary election in Syria. Those Syrians who didn't believe it a total waste of their time went to the polls on Monday. Results have not yet been declared as of this broadcast, but I think we can all go ahead and take a wild guess. Kate, is this any less a fix than I am here blithely assuming it is?
Syria. Poor Syria. I lived there 2008 or 2009. I've visited a lot, and it's a fantastic country that has been sadly, almost destroyed by the regime.
I have been a couple of times myself before the war. Absolutely agree with you, the fantastic country bit.
And I thought it was the most civilised place I've been to, actually, Damascus. As in a sort of deep, thousands-year-old city culture.
Thoroughly pleasant place.
You talked about the Syrians voting if they want to. There's a lot of them who are actually out of the country. We're talking about 6 million. A lot of them are internally, displaced, refugees inside their country. Lots are in bits that the regime doesn't control or have had protests, which is really impressive. The Druze in a region called Sweda have been on the streets. Does it matter? Well, it doesn't really, because, two things are going to be interesting. Assad needs the parliament to change the constitution to allow him to run again in 2028 for president.
Do you like his chances?
I think they're quite good. And secondly, for Syria watchers, it's quite interesting to see who's up, who's in, who's out. So, which families are doing well? Who are the business people who've managed to suck up to the Assads? That sort of thing is of interest to those interested in Syria. But it's a parliament where it's a parliament of loyalists. So it's and the Syrians are great because there's people with lots of black humour particularly since the revolution and the war and all the horrors that have happened. And there's this one, I was reminded of this joke actually from the 90s, from the 80s, from Assad's father, because that family's been in power for over half a century. And, one of the advisors saying, "Mr. President, great news. You've won 95% of the vote. What else could you want?" And he said, "I want the names of the 5%.
It is extraordinary, though, Sean, that this is a universal quirk of tyrannies, they do feel obliged to enact some sort of facsimile of democratic propriety. I mean, everybody knows what the deal is in Syria. President Bashar al-Assad will be president for life or as long as he can hang on to the job. And yet, rather than just saying, yeah, I'm president for life, the hell with you all, anyone got a problem with it, he feels obliged to call an election, which is obviously a total fix, get the parliament to rubber stamp some sort of constitutional reform which will enable him to do this legitimately. We see the same thing, obviously, in Russia. We've seen the same thing very recently in Rwanda. We see the same thing periodically in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Why do they do it?
I think these despots are quite needy people, and they need a little bit of acclamation that you get from going through being the star of your own political farce.
But this is like going to a prop store, buying a dummy Oscar, and then building a podium in your garden and getting somebody to present it to you. I mean, they know it's a fix.
I wouldn't be surprised if Kim Jong-un had actually done that, but you're absolutely right. I mean, there are, of course, some people who support Assad, and the serious Syrians who do support Assad would say that that is a better option for Syria than an Islamist chaos, which would be, they think, the alternative. So there are a few independents in the Syrian parliament, but the result, of course, is not in doubt because 2/3 of the seats are reserved for Assad's Ba'ath Party.
I mean, that is, of course, Kate, the pitch that has been made by generations of Middle Eastern despots. You know, I may be bad, but the alternative is worse. Assad, at this point, depressing a thought though it is, he has basically won, hasn't he?
Yeah. The bits of the country he doesn't control, but yes, he's won. And I mean, I think this is unfair what you've said, Sean, about the alternative, because it wasn't the alternative when people took to the streets. It was a very, very inclusive revolution, as they called it.
This is back in 2011 or so.
2010, 11. And it was very inclusive in terms of sectarian, sex and religions. What they wanted was not that much. And it was Assad who introduced the anti-Sunni element to what he did, which helped build up the nasty Islamist extremists. The other thing is the Syrians were brilliant. I mean, better than we would ever be. They were organised. And you had this sort of patchwork of towns and villages where the doctors' committee or the lawyers' committee, because they were the only organisations allowed to exist under the Baathists because they were professional, they then became the core of the people's committees that were running places. It was really, really impressive. And unfortunately, as we all know, foreign money, in particular from the Gulf, and some really nasty people hijacked what's happened. But in response to your question about why do they hold elections, there was this theory by Iraqis under Saddam Hussein that it wasn't enough for people not to criticise. They had to lie. They had to be forced to lie about the regime, that they loved it, that they loved Saddam Hussein. And
because then I guess you're complicit at that point, aren't you?
It's a sort of psychological, wearing down of the soul.
They had learned to love Big Brother, etc.
Exactly, yeah, all well foretold that.
Well, let us glide with barely a grinding of gears to a country which is pointedly not having an election this year. Ukraine would have had a presidential election in March or April and a parliamentary election last October, were it not for the suspension of normal democratic procedure under martial law occasioned by Russia's invasion. Understandable though this may be, there are reports that Ukraine's democratic structures are cracking under this stress test. More than 10% of MPs are regularly absent when Parliament does convene, and President Volodymyr Zelensky's Servant of the People party, by far the biggest in the Verkhovna Rada, is said to be splintering into factions. Sean, none of this is terrifically surprising, is it? People cannot maintain resolve and unity forever, especially not in, such a stressful and dangerous situation. They're only human.
That's true, although there are other examples of where war has really caused people to rally around the leader. And it's a little bit surprising that hasn't happened in the Ukrainian parliament, as far as I'm concerned. And of course, the main worry about a weak and fragmented parliament in Ukraine is that there's nobody to supervise all the government agencies which are getting billions of dollars in aid coming in, and we don't really know. There's no transparency about exactly how much of that money is being spent. We do know that Ukraine has had a long history of corruption, and it must be the case, and Zelensky has occasionally acknowledged this by sacking a few people, that some of that money is not fully into the right hands.
Well, I mean, Kate, as you would know as well, that there is nothing quite like war for being an engine of corruption. It promotes it to an extraordinary degree, whatever the best will of the people trying to run the country at hand. But when you look at the reports of fracturing, even among Zelensky's own party, is this just an inevitable result, really, of MPs not having as much to do as they once did? So much power under the strictures of wartime has been centralised in Zelensky and himself and his inner circle.
I'm afraid I don't know enough about Ukrainian politics to have a say about that. What you said, the president is really, really powerful. The parliament less so, and the parliament should be scrutinising legislation. Zelensky's party has done a deal where it's working with one of the pro-Russian parties.
The former members of a dissolved pro-Russian party.
Exactly, which rings alarm bells. I guess from the outside it's always a bit surprising. I mean, you say war fosters corruption, but at a time of national sort of existential crisis, I always find it extraordinary that people are looking to make money, and looking to make money in a way that weakens the national defence. I mean, we saw that in Afghanistan, where the ministers and the generals were, selling the soldiers rations or bullets, even as the Taliban were approaching in 2020, 2021. So I know it happens, but it's always really, really very shocking, I think. That capacity.
But, it is. There's a makeable case looking at the other way, Sean, that the chronic corruption amid the Russian armed forces sort of delivered Ukraine early on, because it became clear that vehicles were not maintained, that supplies were not getting through, and the stories have been for decades about corruption in the Russian military have been absolutely legion. But going back to the matter at hand, Ukraine. It's understandable for all sorts of reasons that they have both centralised and indeed personified the war effort in the person of their president. But what is the risk as well as the reward of doing that?
Well, the constitution of Ukraine was set up so that Parliament would be more powerful than the president, and that's gone into reverse now. So there's a lot of power vested in Zelensky, and if he were to be ill, if he were to be attacked, it's really unclear what would happen to Ukraine. You've got one man with so much power, and you could look at Russia and say, there you've got one man with so much power. How is Ukraine going to manage without Zelensky? Maybe it would really be struggling, and there have clearly been a number of attempts on Zelensky's life, presumably from Russian backers, so it's been reported, and that is one of the risks, that you become not a one-man band, but you have so much of the country's fate resting on one man's shoulders.
I mean, Kate, just finally on this, polling among Ukrainians does suggest that they do understand why democracy has been suspended, and they do understand that it's not really possible to run proper elections when so much of the country has left the country, and that obviously the election itself would become a target. Is it possible at all, though, to conduct any sort of democratic endeavour under conditions like this?
Well, I was wondering about this, because how long is this war going to go on for?
Well,
that's the other thing. I mean, we're a number of years in since this phase of the war, and there is absolutely no sign of it ending. So I think that also raises questions about... I guess if Ukraine was doing better, like, for example, Syria, which Damascus controls most of the territory, you can hold elections in a large part of your territory if you're not under threat. And I think that's the problem. That's the difference. If you've got bombs and bullets and people at the front line, I mean, holding an election is a big enterprise.
Indeed so.
It takes a lot of effort.
And Ukraine is a big country.
And I don't know, just the campaign, not just the vote, but the campaigning. Is it feasible? But then, how long, if the war continues, does it never become feasible? And I think that's probably the question that would be raised.
Well, to Portugal, where Sundays may shortly become sleepier, a petition launched by the Commerce Workers Union, which represents shop workers, has attracted sufficient signatures to warrant the deliberations of Portugal's parliament. The pitch calls for the closure of large shopping centres on Sundays and public holidays, and a reduction of working hours more generally, it having become common practice for Portuguese emporia to stay open well past 10 p.m. Sean, obviously in keeping with the traditions of current affairs discussion, there can be no nuanced views here. Either the Portuguese are sensibly attuned to work-life balance, or they're a nation of bone-idle layabouts. Which one is it?
I support the Portuguese workers because just as
Are you some sort of communist, Sean? Is that what you are?
Because just as they are fed up with working all hours, so I'm fed up with shopping all hours. I'd rather watch paint dry than shop on a
I
Sunday.
mean, that's an option. No one's stopping you.
I'd rather spend the day with my children watching the same episode of Friends 24 times than go shopping. I don't need the
sounds
things
like you're
that you
speaking
buy.
from personal experience.
I'm speaking
there.
from personal experience. Only last
Go
Sunday.
shopping on a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday or Saturday?
I think that's fine. But just for one Sunday, I would like not to be sent to the garden centre to buy landscape bark. Do you know how heavy that is? It's back-breaking stuff.
I'm pretty sure you can get it delivered. Possibly even on a Sunday.
Perhaps you've got a solution to all my problems. But I'm very much in favour of things shutting down for a day. And I think it would give our brains a rest. I think just to lie there on the sofa with a good book would be a much better way of spending a Sunday. And I hope that's what Portuguese shopkeepers turn out to be able to do.
See, part of me is sympathetic to that, Kate, but part of me also remembers being a child in Canberra circa the 1970s, 1980s, when nothing was open on Sundays. There were at the time only two TV channels, both of which closed with the playing of the national anthem at about 11 o'clock. And I can remember my family, my parents, my brother and I, being so bored out of our minds on Sunday that we would often just get in the car and drive aimlessly around the city. There was literally nothing else to do. So I'm genuinely not sure where I come down on this. What do you think?
Okay, so I also don't like shopping, right? I recognise that the shops are really annoyed because everyone does online shopping if they can't shop. So I recognise that. About half of British people... So in Britain, it's the big shops that are restricted in their hours and the small shops can stay open. Not surprisingly, the corner shops, 90% of them wanted to stay the same. The workers as well, 90% don't want the opening hours to increase. And the British public, it's about half of them, also don't want to increase the hours that the big shops stay open on a Sunday. So my thought when it was introduced in 94, England and Wales got the Sunday trading hours relaxed. I thought, fine, open your shops on a Sunday, but I think it should be in legislation that you pay your workers 1.5 times. There should be some protection. You pay workers more for working on a Sunday. That's what I would have done.
I cannot speak to the current regulations in Australia, but certainly happily when I was of an age that one was doing part-time work in shops in Australia, it was time and a half on Saturdays and double time on Sundays. So there was never any difficulty getting people volunteering to work on a Sunday. The other thing I would raise, Sean, and this may resonate with you or not, I live not far from an absolutely enormous shopping centre, which I rarely have ventured into because obviously it's ghastly, but I do think of it as kind of a sort of voluntary corral for all the worst people in my particular part of London. All these like ghastly youths in their tracksuits with their vapes are just like all confined in one place all weekend, and I don't have to interact with them at all.
Perhaps there should be some sort of regulation that you have to have a vape to get into Brent Cross shopping centre or wherever it is that you're talking about.
I think that's almost certainly an entirely redundant stricture.
But that the rest of us would be spared.
Have either of you, for recreational purposes, I will ask you first, Kate, ever gone voluntarily to a mall on Saturday or a Sunday?
I really hate malls. I really, really hate them. I don't like shop. I like food shopping, and everything else. I don't know. Sort of reminds me of being a teenager when I thought if I could, I would go and try on clothes and have fantasy about what I might be, and it was all entirely pointless. Depressing. So that and by the way, Sean, if you want bark, watch out in your street, because people do come occasionally and they cut down the trees and they chip, and they will give. If you give them bags, they will give you bags.
I want to come and live with you in Finsbury Park. That's not another country. I have been made to go to a shopping mall several times recently because there's a relatively new one in Oxford near where I live. And I just know that every time I go there, I'm going to spend hundreds of pounds needlessly on things like a chicken-shaped pot that you can keep your eggs in. And I come home feeling ridiculous and tired.
You spend
really
hundreds of pounds on a chicken-shaped pot you can keep your eggs in? I mean, it must be a very fancy chicken-shaped pot you can keep your eggs in.
I think that was about 30 quid. Ridiculous, isn't it?
They saw you coming.
And then by the time you add a few towels and a couple of
How many
pillowcases,
towels do you need? Do you collect them?
You're wondering what is left of life.
I want to get you on the phone with Mrs. Ryan and you can have a strong word with her. I think you're better at arguing in the case than I am at home.
I am absolutely not getting involved with that. Sean Ryan and Kate Clark, thank you both for joining us. And finally, on today's show, if you were paying any attention to the world of cinema last summer, and I for one was not, you may have noticed the excitement around the Barbie film, from its hilarious portrayals of real-life dolls, silly one-liners and the catchy soundtrack. The movie was, it says here, a pink pop culture explosion. Following so-called Barbie summer, London's Design Museum has taken the excitement in their stride, and they are throwing Barbie a 65th birthday party. The new show, simply named Barbie the Exhibition, centres around the toy's influence on fashion, architecture and design, proving to the public that Barbie was a trendsetter long before the film. Monocle's Monica Lillis went down to the exhibition to find out more.
It doesn't take a lover of toys to notice the influence Barbie has on the world. And with the release of the hugely successful Barbie movie last year, the doll coupled with her brand were catapulted back into the forefront of public consciousness. However, the doll, owned by multinational toy company Mattel, has long been intertwined with popular culture. And one place where Barbie's impact is especially pronounced is within the world of fashion and design. This year, Barbie herself turns 65, and to celebrate, London's Design Museum has carefully curated an exhibition dedicated to exploring the brand's relationship with fashion, architecture and, of course, design. It's here I met Danielle Tom, who started by telling me a little bit about the inspiration behind the show.
What we wanted to do in putting on this exhibition was to consider the idea of Barbie, the history of Barbie, through that design lens, and in so doing to acknowledge the importance of the doll and of her world to generations of children. The fact that Barbie was and is primarily a toy, the fact that Barbie is, for want of a better phrase, feminine coded, those things do not prevent us from taking it seriously as an example of design. It's one of the most recognisable brands in the world, and we wanted to explore why that was.
The exhibition is a colourful display of over 250 objects, from impressive film costumes, a display of the dolls through the ages, and even a chandelier of cascading plastic hair. We start at the beginning, though, with Ruth Handler's hallowed first creation.
When you enter the space, the very first thing you encounter is the original Barbie herself, the doll that started it all from 1959, and she's on her pedestal for everyone to see because the doll itself was a pivotal moment in the history of toy design. Barbie was arguably the first adult-bodied, adult-faced fashion doll, and her launch in 1959, although it had originally been greeted with some scepticism, was to prove pivotal. So you encounter this first Barbie, and alongside the doll, we're playing the original commercial from 1959.
Barbie, you're beautiful. You make me feel
Barbie's debut saw her clad in a black and white striped swimming costume, coupled with cat-eye white sunglasses, and her signature blonde hair swooped into a curly ponytail. From her emergence, it was clear that Barbie and fashion would be synonymous. Tom explains.
And all the gadgets gals adore.
In the first instance, by which I mean the first decade of Barbie's existence, her wardrobe, if you like, is reflective of a kind of high fashion ideal. It's very influenced by European couture, but also American sportswear. We're talking established designers like Bonnie Cashin, for example, or in Europe, Dior and Balenciaga. So what Barbie wears at first is reflective of what was seen in high fashion magazines like Vogue, for example. It anticipated this idea of the aspirational adult world. In the late 60s, Barbie's whole look changes. The doll itself is redesigned, but so is her wardrobe. And it's much more in keeping with mod style and this idea of, swinging London and the miniskirt and go-go boots and so on. So all through the decades, Barbie's wardrobe has mapped onto mainstream trends. In more recent years, I think there has been a marked influence coming from the Barbie brand outwards to the consumers. One of the most obvious examples of that, of course, is the recent Barbie core phenomenon. It does go back a bit further than that. If you look at the work of Moschino under its previous creative director, Jeremy Scott, Scott was very heavily influenced by Barbie as a child, and in 2015 he actually put out an entire catwalk collection which was Barbie themed. I think the idea of Barbie core and what it stands for doesn't necessarily reflect what Barbie herself actually has worn. It sort of takes this idea of the brand and distills it down into a series of core elements.
The world of Barbie in design also extends well beyond her wardrobe. With the introduction of the dream house in the early 1960s, the brand began to also centre around the world of architecture and interior design. Tom tells me more.
This is the very first Barbie dream house, which was released in 1962. It's made entirely from cardboard, so it actually came as a folded up box with a carrying handle. And then the idea is that you would unclip it and unfold it, and it folds out into what is effectively a kind of studio apartment. It's also positioning Barbie as, again, keeping up with the times, on trend without necessarily being cutting edge. So all of the furniture here, it is rendered in cardboard, of course, but it's archetypally mid-century modern. You can see the influence of designers like Florence Knoll or George Nelson on this very angular, geometric, quite clean-lined furniture, and the colour story as well. Yellows, touches of pink, sort of very saturated blues, very mid-century, very in keeping with its time.
And naturally, it's hard to imagine Barbie without thinking pink.
Barbie pink as an idea, if you like, is something that doesn't really come into being at the very beginning of the brand's history. It's not until the very late 1970s, perhaps 1980, that Barbie gets associated with pink in such an indelible way. That's the moment when the brand's packaging becomes consistently pink. It's the moment where all of a sudden Barbie's various accessories, her houses and so on, are all being produced in pink. Prior to that, there's much more colour variation, and you'll see in the show that some of the early dream houses are quite unexpected to someone who's familiar with the brand identity of today. So I think that pink has had the success that it has, not only because of those connotations that you mentioned, femininity, romance in some contexts, but also because it offered a kind of visual uniformity that allowed the brand to be immediately recognisable in a retail context, in a media context. And that kind of legibility and ubiquity is priceless in retail and marketing terms.
It's clear that this exhibition strips away the notion that this doll is just a toy. And the Barbie brand has long been a trailblazer in the world of marketing, design and fashion. Barbie has historically reflected trends and influenced contemporary designers and will continue to do so for years to come. For Monocle Radio, I'm Monica Lillis.
That was Monica Lillis with that report, and that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Sean Ryan and Kate Clark. Today's show was produced by Henry Rhys Sheridan and researched by Gunnar Gronlid. Our sound engineer was Sarah Nichol. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Monocle Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.